George wasn't a very good liar, so he wasn't sure how well he would have been able to hide the truth, but the boss seemed too needy to go hunting after possibly distressing facts anyway. After the meal, the guys pitched a few horseshoes and smoked a few cigarettes, but they were all too worn out for much more than that. The men from their work, George from his long hike and close escape. Only after he crawled into bed did he remember that he intended to ask about the men who'd vanished, find out what kind of people they were, if there was a simple reason why so many workers would have gotten skittish enough to bolt so close together. He knew that a hunger for room and board wasn't the only reason men stayed anchored to any job they were lucky enough to find these days, regardless of working conditions. It just wasn't safe to hit the road or ride the rails anymore, not with all those whispers of others like his friend who wouldn't stay underground where they was put. He'd come to realize that Lenny hadn't been the first, just his first. And with what he'd been hearing lately, not even George would have been on the move unless he was being tracked, being hunted. Those men had to have a damn good reason to leave, too. He wondered what it could be, but then sleep overcame him, and he was off in dream, telling the same old story again. The story his friend had always begged for and yet always treated as new. The one about the little house they get on a couple acres with the vegetable garden and the rabbits. Always the rabbits. George jerked awake at dawn when the sun's first rays crept into the room. He'd learned what that first light meant. He'd survived another night, and nothing could get at him until another one fell. The work to come that he normally would have cursed as backbreaking would instead be a relief because it would tell him he was alive. Even a poorly cooked breakfast with bits of shell mixed into the scrambled eggs didn't dampen his mood, and when he leapt with the other men into the wagon and headed out for the barley, he was filled with about as much happiness as his present life could muster. As he worked that day, watching the sun track across the sky, he found himself wishing it would move more slowly. Ever since he'd done what he'd done, there was no end of things out there looking for him. The big lummox had snuffed out so many of them, only they hadn't stayed snuffed. Couldn't even get that right. But George must have made a mess of it big time as well. He'd shot Lenny, seen him fall. He'd shot him in the sweet spot, right where he was supposed to so that the long, troubled journey of his friend's life would be over. Only it wasn't. When he got back to the bunkhouse at the end of the day, he discovered a rope had been stretched between two trees out front, a sheet tossed over it to hang limply. "What do you suppose that's about?" asked George. "I don't rightly know," said Jackson. George had attached himself to the man, hoping to borrow some of his calm. "Been here a piece, but never seen it done before." He shrugged and passed the setup by, heading in for another overcooked meal. When they pushed back from their place, Dick stood up and leaned forward with his palms flat on the table. "I have a treat for you fellows tonight," he said. "As soon as it's fully dark, we're going to have ourselves a picture show." The men shouted excitedly as they rushed outside. "What do you think it's going to be?" said one. "I hope it's a dancing picture," said the quiet one, who surprised them by speaking up at such length. "I like them dancing pictures." "Don't matter to me much," said George, "as long as it takes me away from here." "Oh, it ain't so bad here," said Jackson. "We got food, a place to lay our heads, and sure, Dick's can be tough at times, but believe me, I've seen worse. Who could want anything more than that?" George could, and he wasn't the only one. He could think of a few others like Candy and Crooks, who would want more as well. He knew exactly what it was they'd want, how he was the one who'd made them want it, made them want to join the two friends who looked like they might actually pull off that dream of a couple of acres of their own, living off the fat of the land, and how he'd gone ahead and ruined it for them all. You couldn't blame the big lummox. He didn't know what he was doing, but George, he was supposed to know better. All that came after, that was his own damn fault. Dix directed the men to set up rows of crates in the wide space between the bunkhouse and the stables, and then they sat there, working at their toothpicks, spitting in the dust, waiting for the purple sky to turn black. George didn't like being exposed out in the open like that, but he couldn't figure any way around it. He pressed himself into the center of the men. The boss carried out a projector and fussed with it, not letting any of the others help him with the delicate machine. That didn't stop him from cursing at Willie as the hand played out a length of cable that ran from the small generator which usually kept the boss's house lit. "Settle down, men," shouted Dix. "I don't know exactly what we got ourselves here, but from what they tell me, it's supposed to be a doozy." George shifted uncomfortably on his crate and was relieved when the utter darkness was broken by a beam of light. One of the guys nearest the screen laughed and jumped up, throwing a silhouette on the sheet, but a shot from Dix returned him to his crate. Soon the night was pierced by a beating of drums and the words, "White Zombie," stretched out before them. "Hey, look," someone shouted as Bela Lugosi's name appeared. "It's got that vampire guy in it." George didn't know what the hell he was talking about. He wasn't much for picture shows, at least not lately, not when he'd had more important plans for his money, not just with his money. But best not to think of it. Best not to think of any of it. The missed picture shows, the skipped visits to fine parlors, all sacrificed in pursuit of, forget it all. Maybe this movie, whatever it was, would take his mind elsewhere. But based on how it began, it served only to refocus him more fully on this problem. Off in a country not really so distant, and yet as far away to him as the moon, dead men walked. Dead men who were at the same time somehow undead. Haiti is full of nonsense and superstition, said one character to another, but to be either of those, the thing had to be untrue, didn't it? George understood all too well the truth of his situation, that there could be life after death, though not much of one. And as the movie went on, his skin prickled with recognition. And when, about 15 minutes in, the camera closed in tight on a huge bull of a man, his eyes wide, his soul gone, looking as if he could crush it with one hand, it all became too much. He leapt up from the center of the men, almost knocking a few of them over, ignoring the boss when he shouted at him to stay. He fled, circling to the opposite side of the bunkhouse, cursing. He crouched down there, leaning his back against the wall, and with shaking hands rolled himself a cigarette. He could barely steady his fingers to bring the match to tip, and it wasn't until he smoked it halfway down that the trembling stopped. Jackson was suddenly there with him. Mind if I join you, he asked. George shook his head and waved with his free hand at the patch of ground beside him. They sat there quietly for a while. George wanted to say something, anything, to cover the sound of the movie that whispered at them around the corners of the bunkhouse, but he couldn't think of a damn thing. So what was all that about? Jackson finally asked. George had half a mind to tell him everything. He remembered another man like him, one who George took under his wing after the deed was done. He got George stinking drunk and made him think life would go on after what he had to do. Life went on all right, but not the way either of them had thought. Now, Slim was dead, George was on the run, and there was something after him, which, though no longer capable of running, seemed pretty much unstoppable. But how to begin to tell something like that? Before George could speak, a shuffling sound came out of the desert, one that could barely be heard over the movie's buzz on the other side of the bunkhouse. George noticed at first, his senses having been made more alert to such things due to his recent situation. Jackson noticed him squinting and followed his gaze. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "I don't see anything." "Why would you look at that?" A small dog crawled toward them in the darkness, one of its front legs broken. Even so, it managed to close the gap between them quickly. George pressed his back more forcefully against the wall of the bunkhouse, unable to move any further, even as Jackson stood up and took a step toward it. "Jackson, no!" George shouted, but before Jackson could heed George's warning, he was on his knees beside the thing, reaching out to stroke it. It responded by biting hard into the meaty part of the man's thumb. Jackson yanked back his hand, but the animal wouldn't let go, and so he was pulled into the air as he jumped up. He leapt around in pain, flinging his hand about, snapping the animal this way and that to no avail. It clung to him with the hunger of another world. Jackson's yelps finally propelled George to action. He slid his work gloves from where they were tucked into his belt and grabbed the thing by its hind legs, angry memories flooding back. He knew who had broken that one leg. He knew who had killed it. And yet not even those injuries, sudden, foolish, and fatal, had been enough to stop its vicious hunt. That it still kept coming, tracking him, sensing him out. And if George didn't act quickly, it would turn the man who had come between them into another victim of his unwise choices. He pinched at the hinge of its jaw, forcing it to release its grip, and hurled it to the ground. He brought down his heel, catching it in the midsection as it made to escape, flattening it as surely as if it had been run over by a wagon wheel. But though it burst, intestines spilling out, that wasn't enough to stop it. It still struggled for them. He slammed his heel again and caught it near one ear while Jackson continued to yowl in pain, cradling his arm, unable to help. George could hear a crunch of bone, but because of his angle, he didn't think that had been enough to take care of it. Though its lower jaw now hung at an ugly angle, he could see that he hadn't yet finished it. It moved away from the two men more quickly than George thought would have been possible, and he had a choice. He always had choices. Wasn't that what had brought him here? Too many had died because of him, and so he knelt beside Jackson, held him as the creature vanished into the night. "What the hell was that thing?" said Jackson, puking. He slumped against George. "I don't feel so good."